start. So I'm going to say good morning, good evening, sorry, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm honored to be here as the part of the Grace Series talk. This event dedicated to empowering everyone. For over right now 9 years almost, this series has provided a platform for sharing experiences, knowledge, and inspiration. I've been part of this initiative for a few years now, and currently helping with the help of Geeti, and we miss Andrew, but she helped us a lot. We try to lead this basically. I want to thank all the individuals who have contributed to the Grace Series talk over the years. The previous organizers, Pushpa, Karen, and all the past department heads and our current department head that continue supporting us and make this a special, in this event special. We're keeping their legacy alive by following their footsteps, hopefully. Also, a special thank to Dr. Bhavani for continuing supporting the Grace Series talk. I want to also acknowledge the effort of everyone currently helping us behind the scene to make this a success. Norma, Michelle, and pretty much the entire CS department helping us a lot to make this a smooth running of this event. I'm grateful for dedication and their hard work. So lastly, I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. Your presence and support mean a lot to us. With your participation, we can continue the legacy of Grace Series talk and make a positive impact on the lives of everyone. We have gifts. We have 3 random, basically we have raffles at the end, so stay tuned, and we have a survey, and we're going to give the 3 individuals. So hopefully you're going to stay until the end of the night and get your present. Now tonight we have a very special speaker, Dr. Emily Fox. She is an associate professor of computer science at UTD. Her research and teaching interests lie primarily within the algorithms, subjects of computational geometry and computational topology, with a focus on shape matching and the design of algorithms for graphs with useful topological structures. She received an NFS Career Award as well as the Best Teacher in Computer Science Award from the UTD. She received her PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and before doing postdoc at the Institute of Computational and Experimental Research in Mathematics at Brown University and Duke University. The talk tonight reflects on her professional and personal journey over the last decade. She will offer a brief look into some professional and personal aspects of her recent past, focusing on her research on the optimal transport and transshipment problems, as well as her coming to term with her identity as a woman in computing. During the talk, she will repeatedly emphasize on how asking questions about what is true or possible led to progress on both fronts. In addition, she'll speak about the times when not questioning preconceived notion led to stalled progress. Thank you so much. And without further ado, I'll let you start the talk tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Okay, so yeah, let me start just by reiterating what this talk is going to be about. So again, it's going to be a brief look at my recent past, both professional and personal aspects of it. In particular, focusing on the years since I obtained my PhD at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I'm going to focus on 2 things primarily. First, from the professional standpoint, my work on the optimal transport and transshipment problems. And from a more personal standpoint, coming to terms with my identity as a woman in computing. To clarify, in case you're not aware, the woman part is what I'm going to focus on. That's a relatively new realization for myself. I've known about the computing part for quite a while. What I want to emphasize during this talk is the way that asking questions or not asking questions has been a big influence on my career and personal life. How when I asked the right questions about what is true or possible, it led to progress professionally and personally, but also when I just accepted things as they were without any questioning, it would cause me to stall on both of those aspects. So without further ado, it is spring 2014, and I need a job. So I'm halfway through a one-semester postdoc at the Institute for Computational Experimental Research and Mathematics at Brown University, and I'm studying graph algorithms, which is what I mostly studied for my PhD as well. The semester is coming to a close, but fortunately, Pankaj Agarwal at Duke University has an offer to join him in the fall as a postdoc. Now, when I do this, though, I'm going to change my focus a little bit away from graph algorithms and more on the subject of computational geometry. So Pankaj and his student, Sharath Raghavendra, they have recently found this new result for what's called the geometric bipartite matching problem. To introduce the problem, imagine you have a set of n blue points and n red points in low-dimensional Euclidean space. I'll usually depict points being in the plane, since I'm using slides. And what you would like to do is pair up the points into a bunch of pairs where each pair has one red point and one blue point. The goal is to find a pairing that minimizes the total distance of all the pairs of points. So summing over all the pairs, what is the distance between the 2 points that got paired up? And Pankaj and his student, they figured out, well, it's true you could solve this problem exactly by building a big graph and running an off-the-shelf graph algorithm for bipartite matching, but that would be very slow because the graph would have n-squared edges in it. Instead, you can actually find an approximately best pairing, one where the total distance is very close to optimal in only n log to the order 1 n time, without having to examine all the pairs. Okay, but sometimes we don't want a one-to-one matching. In the geometric transportation problem, instead of you just having a bunch of red and blue points, each point is also assigned a demand. And the goal here is to find what's called a transportation map, which is not just a bunch of pairs where each pair has a red point and a blue point, but a bunch of weighted pairs. So each pair is also assigned a weight. And the goal is to make sure that for each point, the total weight of all the pairs containing that point equals the demand on the point. You want to minimize the transportation map's cost, which is the sum over all the pairs of the weight times the distance between the points. So the total weighted distance. So this problem had been studied before in computer science and in mathematics. In the computer science realm, it's been known as the Earth mover's distance. So the intuition is that you have a bunch of blue piles of Earth and a bunch of red holes in the ground, and you want to push the Earth from the piles into the holes. Try to minimize the number of Earth miles you use. Fast approximations were known for computing the Earth mover's distance, but that's about all they were good for, is actually finding an estimation on the distance. They weren't so good at actually computing a transportation map, which is something you might want if, for example, you're comparing two distributions. You would like to know not only are they similar, but what parts of them are similar to one another. And the weighted pairs of the transportation map can help you know that. So Pankaj had this question. Can we quickly compute an approximately best transportation map as well, and not just the Earth mover's distance? And that was one of the problems that I was going to focus on once I went to Duke. But before I got to Duke, it was summer 2014, and I was watching Summer Games Done Quick at my house. So if you're unfamiliar, Summer Games Done Quick is this charity where a bunch of people get together to play video games very quickly in front of a camera, and you can be entertained as you see the crazy glitches and how they get through the game so fast. Now, part of the appeal of Summer Games Done Quick and other marathons like it is that they'll have a camera focused on the audience, and the people in front of the camera will often offer a commentary on what's going on. And I notice during this particular event, something seems a little different about one of the participants from what I'm expecting. And after watching for a little while, I realized, I think she's trans. That's cool. I've actually not seen a trans person much. I had a couple friends from college who came out after we went our separate ways, but that's about it. And so I also think, it must be rough going through your entire life, knowing since a very young age that you've been in the wrong body and having to deal with that. So that's what they say. That's how the experience goes. They all know from birth pretty much that they're the opposite gender of what they've been assigned. And I never actually questioned this assumption, this innate knowledge of what's going on. Now, that said, I do follow her on Twitter, though. She seems pretty cool. And from there, I end up following a bunch of other trans people, most of whom are women in tech. And the reason I tell myself is because, it's important to learn about disadvantaged groups. How else can I be a really good ally to these people if I don't know what they're going through? And besides, a lot of them are just really cool people. I think they're neat. Nothing more to really think about in that area, right? So now I've moved on to Duke. It's fall 2016, and we've made some pretty good progress on the geometric transportation problem. So Pankaj, Damaya Panagrahi, Kasturi Varadarajan, Alan Xiao, and I, we are putting together this collection of results about computing approximately best transportation maps. This work eventually got published at the International Symposium on Computational Geometry in 2017. So among the results, probably the headlining one is this randomized algorithm for the geometric transportation problem. What this algorithm will do is it will actually find a transportation map where the cost of the map is within an order log squared 1/epsilon factor of the cost of the best transportation map. And it will do so in an expected n to the 1 plus epsilon time. You can run this for any choice of epsilon greater than 0, any points in any low-dimensional Euclidean space. The thing here is you're allowed to set epsilon how you'd like. In this particular case, when epsilon is larger, you get closer to a best transportation map because that ratio goes down, but the running time ends up increasing as epsilon increases. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how this algorithm works. And it's a pretty typical example of a divide and conquer algorithm. So you have your red and your blue points scattered about, say, in the plane. Now what you're going to do is take the smallest box that contains all the points and subdivide it into a big n to the 1/6 by n to the 1/6 grid. Now within each grid box, you're going to grab as many red and blue points as you can so that the collection of red and blue points you grab within the grid box, they have about the same total amount of demand, about the same amount of red demand as blue demand within each individual box. Okay, so now you get all these smaller instances of the geometric transportation problem, and that we'll call those internal subproblems, and you recursively solve them. You delegate to recursion. Now, maybe you weren't able to perfectly balance the red and blue demand within each individual box, so you still have some work to do. Oh, and I should say this is where epsilon pops up, in case you're curious. The bigger epsilon is, the bigger the base case, and the more accurate things get. But the bigger the base case, the slower it is to solve the base cases. So the demand may not have been handled perfectly by recursively solving the internal subproblems. And so what we do then is we create a brand new point at the center of each of the cells, and we assign it a demand equal to what you couldn't handle when you were creating those internal subproblems. Now you have another instance of geometric transportation that we call an external subproblem. Once we solve this, we'll have everything pretty much paired up. And the nice thing is there's only n to the 1/3 cells total here, and because it's n to the 1/6 by n to the 1/6. And so we can actually run an exact algorithm for the minimum cost flow problem on the complete graph created from these n to the 1/3 cells. So with that many, or that few cells, I guess, this actually is not the bottleneck of the whole thing. You can solve this flow exactly pretty fast. Okay, so the approach as I describe it pretty nearly works for solving geometric transportation approximately. The problem is when in an optimal solution, you might have lots of pairs of points where the points are very close together, but unfortunately you laid your grid down so that the points got separated by some grid lines. And now the points are going to separate internal subproblems, and so they'll get paired up differently, possibly using pairs with much larger total distance. There's a pretty standard trick you use to avoid this issue, and that is to randomly shift the grid before you start subdividing things. Okay, now what ends up happening is that if a pair of points is very close together, it's just very unlikely that they'll get separated by the grid lines. Okay, so now if you bear with me, this is going to be the most technical slide. But it helps motivate something that's going to come up a few more times during the research portions. So let's say you know, just for the sake of argument, about the optimal transportation map. I'm going to let tau star of b comma r be the weight of the pair br in the optimal map. Also for b and r, I'm going to let eta br be the side length of the biggest grid cells that ends up separating b and r. Okay, so we create a grid that contains everything, and then we have the internal subproblems, which themselves have smaller grids, and those have smaller grids, and so on. At some point, there is a recursive subproblem that first separates R and B. The grid side length for that subproblem is eta RB. So we can argue the whole cost of our solution is if you sum over all the pairs, you take what the optimal solution would assign as the weight for that pair and multiply by eta RB. That'll give you something proportional to the cost of our solution. We want eta RB to be small as we can so that this is as close to the optimal value as we can get it. But it turns out what ends up happening, again, using relatively standard analysis, is that the expected value of eta RB, well, it's proportional to the distance between R and B, which is probably what you would expect because you got to have distance between R and B times the weight of the pair. That's going to appear in the optimal cost. But it's times however many of levels of recursion there are that may or may not end up separating R and B. And unfortunately, in the geometric transportation problem, this number of levels can be very, very large. If you have widely different demands between some points and others, or some pairs of points are very close together and others are very far apart, you can have a number of levels in the recursion, a large number of levels in the recursion tree. Now, a similar idea was actually used for the geometric transportation problem by Pankaj and Varadarajan way back in 2004. And the reason that it worked for them is because in geometric transportation, or sorry, in geometric bipartite matching, you just want a one-to-one matching. It's like transportation where all the demands are one. And so you can argue, well, what they do is they just say, okay, well, the number of levels where you may or may not separate a pair is just the height of the recursion tree. And we can guarantee that's like log n. Not a big deal. That doesn't work so well for us anymore. And so we're left with the big question for this current line of attack. Is there any other way to bound the number of levels that may or may not separate a given pair of points? And we ended up having this idea that was surprisingly useful, not just in this work, but in follow-up work as well. So let's say you placed your box around the points and you're partitioning things up into the internal subproblems. These cells each have a certain side length. Now imagine around every point we wrap a little box where the side length of that tiny little box is 1/n³ times the side length of the cells for the internal subproblems. So the smaller the cells for the subproblems, the smaller these little motes are. Now, because the motes are so tiny, it is highly unlikely that when you do your random shift, the cell sides are going to run into the motes. In fact, the probability of running into the motes is so small that no mote at any level of the recursion tree is going to get clipped by any of the grids at that level of the tree. It just will not happen with what you call high probability, and we may as well assume that it doesn't happen, or at least try the algorithm a couple times until it doesn't happen. And so we can argue that there's basically not too many levels of recursion where a pair R and B may or may not be separated. If your cells have side length greater than n³ times the distance between R and B, then the motes for R and B will overlap each other, and you just cannot put a grid line down that separates them. On the other hand, if the cells have size smaller than the distance between R and B, there will be a couple grid lines that separate them. They will have been separated by that level. And so the first level that separates them, the side lengths have to lie somewhere in that range. And there are going to be very few levels like that because the side lengths end up dropping pretty fast when you're doing the recursion. Modulo lots of algebra, you get that nice approximation result. And it turns out these motes are going to be useful for a couple other things. But before we get to that, now it's 2018, and I'm lurking on Twitter. And one of the women I'm following retweets something interesting about this thing called gender dysphoria. So this is the idea that if you're transgender and your body doesn't match your internal sense of gender, or people don't treat you the way that you would expect given your internal sense of gender, it can be very distressing, somewhat traumatic. And this woman, Catherine Gibbs, she writes, if you're under the assumption that you're a cis guy, but always dreamed of being a girl, and the only reason you haven't transitioned is because you're afraid you'll be an ugly girl, that's dysphoria. You're literally trans girl already hot. Like the stress about what it would be like to transition. Why are you worried about that? That's an example of dysphoria, according to her. And I don't know why, but when I read this, it seems kind of important to me. And so I have to ask this question. Wait, do I want to be a girl, but I'm afraid I'll be an ugly? And I think it through. And after some careful consideration, I realize I'm not terribly masculine to begin with, so, things would probably work out all right. And by the inverse of the implication, obviously, if I'm not worried about that particular thing, I don't have dysphoria, I'm not trans. Still though, I never asked why that tweet seems so important to me. Okay, so now it's spring 2019. And there's been a big breakthrough in the transportation problem. So Kesson et al., they found a better randomized algorithm for the geometric transportation problem. What their algorithm will do is, with a high probability, meaning almost certainly this thing is going to work, it will find a transportation map where the cost is at most 1 plus epsilon times the optimal. Such an algorithm is called an approximation scheme. And it will do so in time epsilon to the negative order d and log to the order d of un. So for a fixed epsilon, let's say 0.01, you're going to get a transportation map that is very close to being the best one possible, and the running time is going to be nearly linear in n, which this is pretty much the best result you could hope for here. Oh, and u here, you can actually choose the better of two options. It's either the ratio of the maximum distance between a pair of points and the minimum distance, or, well, that's probably the point set spread, excuse me, or it's the largest of the demands on all the points, assuming that the smallest demand is 1. Okay, so here's how, or like at a high level, what their algorithm does. You start by building what's called a spanner graph. So this is a graph over the points, as well as some additional vertices, that approximately preserves the distances between the points. So for any pair of points from the geometric transportation problem, their distance within the graph should be at most 1 plus epsilon over 2 times the actual Euclidean distance between them. Now, what you do, the way to get the graph, is you build something called a randomly shifted quad tree. So you start with a box that contains all the points that's been randomly shifted. And now imagine dividing the box up into 4 quadrants. The graph is going to contain a node for the top box. It'll contain a node for each of the 4 subboxes, and the top box will connect directly to the subboxes with an edge. And then you recursively keep breaking things down further and further. You need to add some additional edges on top of this tree in order to actually make it a good spanner, but it still has a lot of tree-like structure. And the total size ends up being only epsilon to the negative order d and log to the order d in u. So the size ends up being the same as that promised running time. At this point, you reduce transportation to the other problem I said I'd talk about, called the transshipment problem in graphs. So let me tell you a little bit about what transshipment is. So this is a problem defined on undirected graphs. You have your undirected graph G. Every edge is given a positive cost, which I'll denote with C, and each vertex is given an arbitrary demand that may be positive or negative, but with a promise that if you sum over all the demands, they sum to 0. Okay, now fix an arbitrary orientation of all the edges in the graph. So for each undirected edge, it's going to go one direction or the other. It doesn't really matter. This is just for the sake of the next definition. We say a flow is a function assigning an arbitrary real value to each of these directed edges. If you assign a positive value to a directed edge, you can imagine you're pushing some material forward along the edge. And if you assign a negative value, you're pushing some material backwards along the edge. We say the flow routes B if for each vertex, sum of all the flow values for edges leaving V minus sum of all the flow values for edges entering V equals the demand. Or in other words, you're trying to push stuff around this undirected graph so that the total amount of material leaving each vertex is equal to the demand. Negative demand would mean you want a net positive amount entering the vertex. Okay, given a flow, it has a cost. The cost of the flow is the sum over all the edges of absolute value of the flow on the edge times the cost of the edge. So when you're pushing your material around, please use cheap edges. And What we want is a flow that routes B with minimum total cost. Okay, so Castanel, they build a spanner graph over the points, reducing to the transshipment problem. For the demands, you ask, well, for each red point, I would like the flow to send that red point's demand out into the graph. For each blue point, I would like the flow to bring that much in. And so a flow that routes the demands, it's basically going to change from having pairs directly from red to blue to these little paths going from red to blue. We expect distances to get distorted by only 1 plus epsilon over 2 factor. And so if we can somehow find an optimal flow, its expected cost will be at most 1 plus epsilon over 2 times the cost of the optimal transportation map. We don't have time to find an optimal flow, though. We're going to have to approximate that also. So there's step 2 of their algorithm. What they do is they compute a particular kind of greedy flow where the cost is at most log to the order 1 of u divided by epsilon times the optimal cost. And the time taken to do so is linear in the size of the spanner. The way this particular flow works is you can imagine for each vertex in the spanner, you ask what its demand is, and you just send flow straight up to the root because the spanner had pretty close to tree-like structure. So you take a path straight from the vertex to the root, and what ends up happening is that if you have like positive demand and negative demand close to one another, the paths will collide pretty low down in the tree and cancel out, and it'll be cheap to send flow in this way. And you can argue it has a cost that's log u over epsilon times the optimal. There is this fancy framework that I'm not going to even try to get into, where if you can find nice flows that are reasonable like this over and over again, you'll eventually find a 1 plus epsilon over 2 approximate flow. Turn that flow into a transportation map, and the whole thing is your promised 1 plus epsilon approximation scheme. Now, there's this factor of u in the running time, though, and I found this kind of odd. The algorithm we had earlier that I started talking about at the beginning, the running time didn't depend on spread, and it didn't depend on the magnitude of the demands. So is it possible to remove this runtime dependency on u? It's not exactly straightforward. The main issue is that both the size of the graph, the number of extra edges we need to add to make sure it's a good spanner, and the number of times we have to compute a greedy flow, they both depend on how many quad tree levels there are where a pair of points may or may not be separated. And the easiest way to bound the number of levels where a pair may or may not be separated is by the depth of the quad tree, which is log u. So I asked this question: is there any other way to bound the number of levels possibly separating a given pair of points? Oh, wait, I asked this exact same question earlier. It turns out we can use the mode idea that we had from last time. So my PhD student Joshua Liu and I, in a paper that appeared at the 2020 International Symposium on Computational Geometry, and later the Journal of Computational Geometry, we got an epsilon to the negative order d and log to the order dn time algorithm for geometric transportation that gives you that 1 plus epsilon approximate transportation map. The high-level idea is you just consider it's very unlikely we're going to clip the moats when we build the quad tree, do a bunch of analysis. That said, the analysis is not exactly trivial. In particular, had a very difficult time preparing the journal version where working out exactly the right analysis for the random shifts of the quad tree so that we can make exactly the nice claims we wanted took quite a lot of effort. It's too bad randomness ends up being so essential to results like this, or we could have saved ourselves some work. Oh well. Okay, so now it is June 29th, 2020. Somebody posted a link to a webcomic. Okay, so there's this webcomic author, May Dean, and she started a 3-week-long storyline on her semi-autobiographical webcomic called Real Life Comics about her coming to terms with being trans. Here's the first day's comic. Apparently what got her was that tweet I mentioned earlier, or at least a Facebook reshare of the tweet. Affected her more than it did me, I guess. And I'm reading about her, and I realized that she came to terms with this in her mid-30s. Well, that doesn't make sense because I thought trans people always knew they were trans and wanted to deal with it since they were kids. So I decided I'd better follow along with this comic storyline so that I, to further my mission of better understanding what's going on here. And pretty soon I'm checking for updates first thing every single morning. Well, now it's July 16th, 2020. I'm rocking my 5-month-old back to sleep after feeding him. It's like 3 in the morning. May's storyline is coming to a close. And I'm thinking about some things. I've learned by now through the comic and other areas that gender dysphoria is not always quite so obvious. There's not like a big alarm going off saying wrong gender, wrong gender. It's more subtle than that. There's no perfect signs if you have it or not. And since there's no diagnostic you can trust, I guess it's more of an internal thing. It comes down to kind of a personal feeling of what seems best to you. So I guess I should ask the question, what would feel best to me? And I'm thinking it through, walking my kid, and within a minute, I realize, oh crap, I'm trans. Well, I've made slow but steady progress since then on my transition. I had lots and love of support. My family's been great. I came out publicly in March 2023. All my colleagues have been wonderful. I've been pretty lucky on this front. And now I'm here giving this talk to all of you. But before I wrap up, I guess I do need to observe, like, during this whole process, I was still working. So I probably should have to get back to that, huh? Okay, so now it's spring 2022, and my postdoc advisor is back at it. So Pankaj and some others, they figured out a fast geometric bipartite matching approximation that actually doesn't use randomness. I thought randomness was fundamental to all these things, so that was pretty surprising. Their new algorithm closely resembles the one by Pankaj and his student from a while ago, just for the geometric bipartite matching problem. And so I wonder, well, do we really need randomness to compute best transportation maps as well? Or, yeah, do we really need randomness to compute best transportation maps? I mean, we could do something with our approaches that are pretty different. And Joshua and I, same PhD student, at the IEEE Foundations of Computer Science Conference 2023, we found there is a deterministic approximation scheme, meaning it always returns a good transportation map. And the running time is a small epsilon to the negative order d and log to the order 1 of n. And something that was kind of neat and surprising about this result is it was somehow faster than the fastest known approximation scheme for geometric transportation and geometric bipartite matching, which should be easier, somehow faster than the best deterministic algorithm known for these problems, or even the best randomized algorithm known for these problems. So by taking a step back and coming at it from a different angle, we actually got a better result. So I'll briefly say what we did to make this possible. Okay, so the main thing is the place randomness shows up in the original algorithm is we randomly shift the quad tree. So don't do that. Now, the problem is if you don't randomly shift the quad tree, there's this chance that a pair of points that really want to be in a pair, maybe a very high weight pair, get separated very high up in the quad tree. And so the distance between them in the graph ends up being much higher than it was in the original space. Okay, so what we do to fix that problem is at each level of the tree for each cell, you just look for all the other cells that are reasonably close to it, and you add direct edges, making a bunch of little cliques. You lose a lot of the tree-like structure when you do this, unfortunately. But also, it makes for a really good spanner that actually requires fewer edges overall than the old spanner. This one only has epsilon to the negative order d m log n edges. That's where we get the runtime improvement. The other idea is, well, now we don't have the nice tree-like structure. That greedy algorithm from earlier, we still need something that gives you within like a log to the order 1 of n approximation that we can run over and over again. And that's not going to happen without the nice tree-like structure. If we just greedily send flow straight up, it might be much more expensive than the best flow in this graph. And so what we ask is, well, for each vertex, suppose I were to randomly shift a quad tree. Let's figure out what's the probability that it would end up in each of the cells at a particular level. And when we're sending flow up from that vertex to the root, send it proportionally to the probability that it would have ended up in each of those cells. Okay, so for example, here, let's say this is a vertex of the spanner graph. Here's 4 cells, somewhere higher up in the quad tree. Those cells get their own vertices. The flow path coming out of that red vertex, well, if I were to randomly shift this whole box by a certain amount, there is about a 0.3 probability that that top right cell would still contain the vertex. And so we'll send a 0.3 fraction of its demand up through that vertex with a quad tree cell. There's a very tiny probability that the lower right cell would contain the vertex. So we'll spend a much smaller amount of flow. And the biggest probability is that the lower left cell would end up overlapping the vertex. And so we send most of the flow through there. And the thing that's pretty neat about this approach is that you deterministically, there's no randomness involved in these calculations and how much flow you send. The cost of the flow you get actually approximate the expected cost if we were to do the randomly shifted quad tree approach. By asking the probability that we take certain routes through certain vertices, we actually end up estimating what would have happened if we used randomness in the first place. And because randomly shifting gives you a decent approximation for the flow, well, this must also. And you can boost it to get that 1 plus epsilon by repeatedly computing more and more flows for different demands. So a little aside about transshipments in general graphs. There are also fast approximation schemes for the transshipment problem, several that were known by this point. Now, what a lot of them do is they will randomly embed the vertices of the graph into low-dimensional Euclidean space. They'll do so in a way where the distance between the points in Euclidean space is relatively close to the distance between the points in the graph. And then at least a handful of these algorithms will take the points in Euclidean space and approximately solve the transportation problem on those points. And as you just saw, we can approximate the transportation problem by reducing to transshipment, but in a very particular graph. So Joshua and I were able to use our techniques for getting that deterministic transportation algorithm to get a new near linear time, epsilon to the negative order 1, m log to the order 1n time algorithm. So here m is the number of edges in the graph. Approximation scheme for transshipment in general undirected graphs. This was the first this is the first almost linear time approximation scheme for transportation that didn't have a dependency on the costs of the edges in the graph. But we had to start with that step of randomly embed the points in Euclidean space. So this algorithm still used randomness. Okay, well, that led to this question. Do we really need the randomness for transshipment as well? And recently I found, no, you don't. There's an epsilon to the negative order 1, m log to the order 1n time deterministic deterministic approximation scheme for the transshipment problem in general undirected graphs. The one bullet point high level idea here is we do a similar thing, or I do a similar thing to what was done for approximating transportation, where you ask, send flow up through the spanner as if you were doing random shifting based on the probabilities from random shifting. You do the same here. If you were to embed the graph into what's called a random tree metric and send flow up from the leaves of the tree to the root of the tree metric, what's the probability that you would send flow to various vertices? Well, we'll deterministically send flow to the vertices of the graph as if we were doing this random embedding in a tree metric. And you end up estimating the cost of that random embedding approach. So like I said, this is a pretty recent result. I actually presented it 2 weeks ago at the European Symposium on Algorithms of 2024. Okay, so I'll offer a quick summary of what I talked about. There were several moments over the last several years where asking the right questions helped me progress both in my professional and personal life. On the other hand, there were times where I just assumed I knew what was going on. I didn't question it, and I delayed progress, stealing years from myself. Now, you'll have your own professional and personal lives to live. And so I'd like you to think about what being left unasked for you. From a professional point of view, are there any tools or techniques you're using in your careers or your research that aren't necessarily the best ones for the job, but you're just using them because of momentum from yourself or others? Is there some skill you've developed over time or technique that you practiced that you can apply in a new context? Kind of like how work on transportation eventually became work in transshipment itself. And on a more personal note, is there anything left to understand about yourselves that understanding it would end up helping you live a more full life, both to benefit yourself and those around you? So now it's September 17th, 2024. I've been asked to give a talk. I have one last question. I wonder how it'll go. Thank you.
I feel like we'll figure it out and have. I sent you the survey link in that. Do you see that in your chat? Maybe you can.
Oh, I don't have chat happening.
Oh, okay. So you
I'll leave
can-
this up for now.
Okay, okay. So I'm gonna use my laptop then. I'm gonna add-
Oh, I see. You need me to pull. Okay, I can pull it.
Yeah. That's fine.
Yeah, that's fine.
It's a picture. Yeah, that one.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
So you're gonna scan it and then join, basically answer the questions in the survey, and then we're going to use some randomized way to find the winners of tonight. Meanwhile, if you have any questions, please raise your hand and you can ask your questions.
Yes.
Asking question research.
Mhm.
So I think generally asking question is good. Then sometimes by pausing the work, asking a new question, you actually, slowing yourself down from, chasing this kind of mainstream path that everyone is following. So do you find yourself in that situation? When you pause and ask question in your past, doing your research?
Oh, did I like go down a rabbit hole and get stuck? Yes, that happens sometimes. So one strategy is you ask about things that haven't been done before that maybe you can make a unique contribution to. While in parallel, I also have some other things going on at the same time that are maybe a bit more likely to bear fruit. Kind of a balance between the high risk, high reward things and the get the stuff done for now. Yeah. Yes. Oh, I have an 8-year-old and a 4-year-old. So I came out 2 years ago, and there was one comment about having 2 moms because used to a mom and a dad. That was the worst of it. Like the one-off comment. Kids don't care. It's been fine. And then the younger one doesn't remember the time from before. No, and the school's been fine too. Like I just sent an email. It's like, hey, I'm changing my name. And they're like, okay. Never said anything. Yes.
Whether so at some point you knew that was right, like having randomness, like you need randomness to be able to have a better algorithm in which the point pairs are not separated by grid lines. But the idea that you ended your talk with is to question that understanding of whether randomness is actually needed or not. Uh, doesn't doesn't that affect confidence in what you know and understand?
It does. Yeah, I mean, sometimes you're pretty convinced that something is true. Like you need randomness for these randomly shifted grid or quad tree techniques. And it's True. Yeah. And it's good to feel like, yeah, we got this down. Here's the best possible result. But sometimes you learn something like, oh, they were able to do it for bipartite matching. I probably should question this assumption and explore it. Now, maybe exploring it doesn't lead anywhere. You don't know yet, but I think it's worth doing. And if it does lead somewhere, that can be pretty impactful. Sorry. Yeah. Yes.
There is something about choosing a direction to work on that is probably not mainstream.
Yeah, you can't spend all your time chasing each idea, right? You do have to settle and work hard on something, but it's also easy to get stuck in a rut and just keep going with what you know forever. So it's good to make sure that you don't have to stay stuck in that rut. Thank you. A combination of general interest, like genuine interest and coincidence. So I did my undergrad at Illinois also, and my favorite classes were the theory ones. So I knew pretty early I wanted to do algorithms. My favorite professor while I was there happened to be in computational geometry and was moving into to topology. And so that's where I picked up my interest in that area. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And it also, unlike cinematic a little bit. But my question was, during times of adversity and hardship, how do you ignore it and continue driving towards your goals and passion?
It's a good question. um, Sometimes it just takes time to to recognize you're not going to get through it right away. On research problems, sometimes you think you know what the right approach is, and you run into a wall and you need to back off and look at something else for a while. More personally, once I figured out things that I wanted to transition, it still took a little bit longer than I would have liked. So I kept pushing for it, but also focused on other things, try to make progress somewhere, professionally or personally, during the time. Probably cleared up some other personal things going on, made those better, because just look for ways to make progress. If you can't get everything you want right away, maybe there's something else you can have for now. Not saying give up on what you really need, but try to make the best of it, I guess.
No. Accepting this song.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much. And now I'm gonna read the winners of the night. Are you guys ready? So let's see. Okay, I have the raffle number 1887, and if they emailed it to you, I also have the names. Parmeet, Commandor, sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong. Very good. So that's our first winner. Second winner, I'm gonna read the name, first, Diep Duan. And then, so you know, you're the first winner, so you can choose which one you want. You the shirt, I would pick the shirt for you, but it's you decide. And second winner, okay, yeah, you can come and pick your own. And finally, our last winner tonight, raffle number 70 to 80, Lorna. Okay, awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us tonight. Thank you, everybody. Yeah. Can we take a picture? The department group, so maybe I can have one of them. Okay, I will take it. Yeah. Okay, I want to come to the. Okay, good. I'll go with you. I want to come to everything.
Big floor.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, also, I see somebody else. I wasn't sure. Is that okay? Take a picture?
The size was a t-shirt. So if you can find the binding.
Oh, she can. Okay, I'll.
No problem.
You want to stay in the middle?